Some of the things you're running on, hell, here's my big one that I'll bring it up and I'll be blunt about it. I do not partake in the devil's lettuce in the hemp products, but I do see that it is a huge potential attribute for the state of Texas. Whether it is for tax revenue, whether it is for job growth, industry standards, for regulation, there's a lot of avenues that I look at as the hemp community, especially as an agricultural crop. And I look at it as, so the cannabis industry just alone, that's beyond talking about hemp in general. You're looking at a $500 million a year industry in tax revenue for the state, which could ultimately offset the cost of a lot of property tax. If you really think about the slogan, I mentioned earlier that I have is weed bucks off your tax bill. A lot of that money could go into the infrastructure. And I know that you are campaigning on, or one of your areas that you want to touch on is hemp reform. And so is it a full cannabis legalization, or is it just off of an agricultural industry side?
So it's both. And I'm not going to say full legalization. It's kind of like what it is right now, where we do have access to some of these products, but there is some regulation. It's to tighten up that regulation and to ensure that it's not gotten rid of. Because right now there's a nasty little coup that's going on behind closed doors, to where you have a lot of special interests who are pushing the Texas Compassionate Use Program, or TCUP. And in essence, it's a legal cartel that a select few companies get to do, and they charge astronomical rates. Well, you can go and get a product for 30 to $50. They're going to charge you 100 to 150 for the exact same one. They charge stupid amounts, and that's not economical. So if you want to apply to TCUP, you have to apply to the program. You have to get the license, and you have to go to a special doctor. And it's not cheap to do this. It's a racket. That's all it is. Yeah. And I've seen through that. So I want regulation of it. I don't think it should be completely free.
So you don't think it should go for recreational use? You think for medicinal property purposes only?
I mean, people are going to do it recreationally. I view it like alcohol.
I agree. Okay. So
to be able to purchase it at a controlled shop where we know they're getting good
with regulation.
I guess you could say where they're going to get the good shit and not stuff that's tainted by like fentanyl or anything like that, from buying at a local, dealer, through cartel means and other nefarious means. That's what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Which would ultimately, one of the good things about that is going through, using EPA and the FDA and such, it would help, I think, prevent a lot of these pesticides and herbicides that such as the cartels are using for their grow operations, that is essentially getting in individuals that partake in its, blood system, which are cancer causing agents and poisons, you know what I mean? So good. You're more on the recreational legalization side. What do you think about, could the tax revenue be utilized for it to offset our tax burden, our federal tax burden, our property tax burden? And as well as, so I believe it looks like just on the base level, we're looking at 100 to 300,000 jobs. How much of it of an influence and how benefit can our state see from that, running on that?
So right now, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick tried to criminalize and outlaw this industry last year.
I signed that petition to tell him to fuck off.
Glad you did. A lot of people did. It gave the middle finger to him, and it showed that the Governor Abbott of, hey, this isn't a topic that I probably shouldn't engage with the same rhetoric as a lieutenant governor. So we got to see a divide between Abbott and Patrick. Now, here's a real cost that nobody has put together yet. And I put this together this past week. So if that were to happen right off the bat, there'd be a negative impact of $1.3 billion to the state of Texas revenue. Very quickly. So we get roughly $600 million in taxes, sales tax off of hemp, selling of hemp, and then factor in unemployment. So I went and I got the average amount for unemployment of how much that people get. And I multiplied that by the average time someone's on unemployment in the state of Texas. And I multiplied those two together. And the number was just shy of $700 billion.
No shit.
No shit. Sorry, 700 million. So
Oh,
the
okay.
total.
I was going to say,
Sorry. 700 million. I misspoke. 700 million. Those two combined comes up to 1.3 billion just off of that. And you're not looking at the additional economic cost of that. When
Yeah.
a lot of these businesses, they have loans out for well
Mhm.
over $100,000, and there's 8,000 businesses. That is a
Yeah.
lot of additional revenue. So if you're thinking about it, if you have an average loan of $100,000 and there are 8,000 businesses, that means you will have a negative impact in our GDP alone from defaulting of 800 billion. And that one is with a B. So
Yeah,
that's the
God.
real impact that our lieutenant governor was trying to do. 800 billion, because that would mean those companies and those businesses would default. Because I've talked to a lot of these shop owners, they can't afford that. If
Yeah.
the industry gets shut down and all their loans are recalled, they're screwed. They're declaring bankruptcy.
Yeah.
That's a huge negative impact right there.
Well, here's another caveat to that. So on the legalization side, if it was legalized on recreational, so it would also save the Texas taxpayers $200 to $300 million per year just in the criminal justice system alone, because all these low-level offenses wouldn't be prosecuted, that they wouldn't be incarcerated. Essentially, you're not going to harden these low-level criminals into hardened criminals. So a lot of people aren't taking the general perspective on what the legalization process could possibly do for the state. Right now I was wrong on my numbers originally. So we have 67% consensus in Texas as pro recreational marijuana legalization. Medicinal use, we're at 87% or 83%, something like that in those numbers. Texas is leaning towards the legalization, and they're seeing, especially when you can go over state lines to Louisiana, you can go to Oklahoma, you can go to New Mexico, and you can get cannabis in those areas from dispensaries, and it's a clean cannabis, where now people are starting to lean. And then I think a lot of people are getting smart to the prohibition on cannabis. It was all established all because of William Randolph Hearst, and he was a paper tycoon, and he didn't want to compete with a much more efficient cash crop in hemp to make paper. And it was just a huge con from that them in the early 1900s. And then Harry Asinger or Aslinger or whatever the asshole's name is, he ended up getting appointed to the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, by Andrew Melton, who was one of the heavy investors for DuPont, and they were in a contract to make nylon rope, which, guess what? You can make more efficient rope out of hemp, and it's better on the environment. So, I think a lot of the Texas public is getting smart to the flawed prohibition, that it would help the economy. Ultimately, it's a good way to get to Gen Z, and I'm just going to go into my more, libertarian views. Who the fuck is the government to tell me what I can or can't put in my goddamn body? If I'm not hurting anyone in my household, who the fuck is the government to tell me otherwise? You know what I mean? Like, as a conservative and a Republican, all the Republicans are going off of a basis of small government, less, infringement in your rights. But all we're seeing every day is Democrats and Republicans are infringing more and more into our personal lives. Instead of stepping back and saying, you live your life, I'm going to run the state, and I'm going to let you do whatever you're doing in your household without affecting other people. And I love your stance on going towards pushing, marijuana and cannabis, and which I hate the word marijuana because that's not even the actual term for it. But that's all based off of reefer madness. It's
Mary
all
Jane, weed, chronic.
it's all propaganda. It's all propaganda, and it
icky.
just shows the corruption within our government.
And you're right. There's a lot of corruption that dives deep with this. And when you start peeling back the onion layer and figuring out who's involved, what's going on,
Pharmaceuticals.
exactly, that's part of it.
Big
There's a
fucking
lot
pharma.
of, gotta take big pharma down, and you see that's part of the big donors. big donors, big insurance companies, they don't give a damn about us. All we're seeing is a cash cow. And it's time for us to break that cycle. And that's what I look at. When it comes to every policy, every belief, and everything that I do, I evaluate. I don't just make a brash decision out of emotions or arrogance. I take information in, I look at both sides, I disseminate what's going on, and then I make a decision. And if something new comes in, I'm okay with changing a position. I'm okay with updating it because of new information. I'm not just going to get stuck on an old set of way. And I think that's where we have a problem with a lot of our officials. They get stuck in ego. They go on one track and then they're not going to change it. We've seen Dan Patrick and we've seen Abbott do that. They go on one thing and then they just stick with it, or they become very wishy-washy. It's like, well, maybe which ways are my donors leaning? Like,
Yeah.
you could tell there's the puppet master at play.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm very careful with where I get money from, who I have alliances with, and who comes around my circle, because I've seen these games get played. I was warned very early on by a contact of mine. He was like, you're on their radar. They're afraid of you. Be very careful with who you trust. Be very careful with what's going on, and limit the amount of drama, because they're going to try to pull you into some stupid shit.
Yeah.
So I learned this very early on, and I've seen this happen already. So I keep things as lean as possible and as cheap as possible so that I can be more effective with what I have. And that's part of the reason why I had to be careful. So just so y'all are aware, during the whole Hill Country flooding, I actually did several interviews with the media, and none of them went online. None of them they aired.
Really?
Really. I raised a red flag, and I wasn't telling them I was running. I raised a red flag that citizens in Leander received a wildfire evacuation notice in the middle of the flooding.
Wildfire.
Yep. And I heard the recording. I heard one of the citizens who had the voicemail and of the recording that they were given. And she showed me the timestamp. It was in the middle of the night. And it said wildfire evacuation notice. That was one of the things that went through. And I brought that to a news outlet. I talked to them on air. They recorded the segment and what was we considered ground zero in Leander. It never aired.
So you're pro cannabis, right? What about psilocybin, mushrooms, and cacti and such, like that, other natural plants? What is your take on it?
I believe that God gave us different plants that can actually help us. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to maybe put a target. I'm iffy on the psilocybin right now, not because of its benefits. Sorry, not psilocybin. I think it's ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca, yeah, cacti.
I'm kind of iffy about that because from what I'm seeing is there's some legislation that we got pushed through about ayahuasca coming in. And our former governor, Rick Perry, is pushing for ayahuasca. They're pushing for some of these treatments as experiments, as possibilities. But what I'm hearing in the back channels right now is there's a dirty little play that's happening, that they're investing in the industry. They're investing in building out frameworks right now. And so when it does hit and it does become legal and all those things happen, they're going to set massive profits. It's also part of the reason why SB3 was getting criminalized. It was recriminalized. It was for two reasons. One, to start putting the lid back onto people, putting the lid back onto it, profiting for teacup. But then the other aspect was it opened up a deeper conversation about mental health and veterans and different types of alternative treatments.
Hell yeah.
So there's another avenue to that. So I'm following this very closely of what is going on behind the scenes, because I'm all for helping our fellow veterans. I'm all for helping people who have been through shit.
Yeah.
And because I can say the medication that the VA gives us is absolute bullshit. It's crap what they do. It's delay until you die or medication until you're a zombie.
Yeah, kick the can down the road, essentially.
Exactly.
So,
it's not a
so that's essentially why I didn't say MDMA whenever I asked that question. But I do believe that all of that needs to go through some channels of research and some better studies put on it for mental health and such. Look, I'm on the fence on full legalization on ayahuasca. I do think that psilocybin mushrooms, they should be legalized just the same as cannabis. But I do agree with you on ayahuasca. And I will say this, them profiting off of something good, doing something good, if that's the only way to get it passed, then I'm going to support it. Everyone's got to make some money. Look, with the cannabis industry, look how many billions of dollar industry that is. At least they're smart enough to get in on it early. It's no different than Nancy Pelosi's fucking back channel insider trading bullshit that
Yeah.
she's got billions off of, or millions off of. But look, if that's the only way to get it legalized, then I'm a supporter of it. You know what I mean? I'm going to say that because, you know, I know you stand for mental health. And so, and it's funny because cannabis is like the heart of, you probably don't see it like that, but whenever I look at everything you're campaigning on, cannabis is the heart of your campaign. Because every time it beats, that heart beats and it goes to mental health, and it's what cannabis and those other avenues can do for mental health. And it's, you know, your anti-pharma and big pharma and vaccines and such. And I look at how much that heart beats in cannabis and the prohibition caused by the big pharma and vaccination companies. And then I look at the border crisis and how much cannabis and other narcotics are coming over the border, so that heart beats, and it could essentially help facilitate that. It'll pay for a border wall, for God's sakes. You know what I mean? And more border security. You know, the heart will beat and it goes to the Texas militia. And, you know, it could fund that Texas militia. That heart beats and it goes to the property taxes, you know, lower taxes. Guess what? You can offset the taxes for it. So I look at cannabis and the other, you know, natural medicines as, you know, a heart of your campaign. And I don't know if it's something you thought of or if you've looked at it in that aspect, but whenever I look at you overwhelmingly, that's what I see from it. Like me, it was surprising to me that you're not running on the cannabis as your number one. And then that's the root, and then the tree is growing from that, and it's touching every facet of your campaign, because you can tie everything back to that cannabis policy and really, really go a long way. You know, mental health, it can also get into the rehabilitation facilities for drug rehabilitation, you know, the mental health facilities, you know, like there's so much education system, like cannabis can turn around and it can fund some programs that can ultimately fund tech programs in these high schools. And, you know, whether it's welding or, you know, CNAs or estheticians or NDT or whatever they're funding. And I think that cannabis as an industry and the amount of infrastructure it can build around us can ultimately produce so much additional revenue for the state.
And it can. And part of that I had to be careful on. I say be careful is a lot of Republicans, a lot of the old school conservatives who actually have been voting.
Fuck them.
They don't like that. And it's like, I've lost endorsements and I lost support, a lot of support because of that. But at the same time, it's a common sense ground and to see both sides of the aisle of what's really happening and how do we work together to solve that. Because